The rain fell in steady sheets over the city of Paris, a soft and endless rhythm that turned the stone streets into dark mirrors and washed the dust from the tiled roofs in a quiet ritual of renewal. For 3 days and 3 nights, it did not stop. The city, always bustling and unruly, slowed beneath the weight of the storm. Merchants called less often, their voices dampened by cloaks. Horses trudged carefully through puddled alleys, and even the bells of Notre Dame rang with a muffled echo, as though the air itself was thick with silence. On the 3rd night, in a narrow lane behind the great market halls of Les Halles, a woman laboured alone in a draughty attic above a butcher's shop. The room was lit only by the flicker of a stubby candle and the glow of the hearth, which struggled against the chill that slipped through the cracks in the walls. The mattress was stuffed with straw, the sheets thin and damp from the storm's creeping fingers. Beside the bed sat a midwife whose eyes were sharp and mouth pursed, hands red from cold water and effort. At her feet, a chipped basin steamed faintly. The woman in labour, Claire Delacourt, gritted her teeth against the next wave of pain, sweat dampening her already soaked curls. She was not young, but neither was she yet old, and her body bore the signs of a life lived in service to necessity. Her hands were always dry and cracked, her back bowed from years of work. Yet as she pushed through the agony, there was a strange peace in her face, as if she had always known her life would bring her to this precise moment. A storm outside, a child arriving within. At last, with a gasp and a final cry that was more whisper than scream, the infant emerged, slick and small, her skin tinged bluish from the cold air. For a moment, she did not cry. The midwife frowned, briskly clearing her mouth and nose, then turned the tiny body over and tapped its back with a firm but careful hand. The moment stretched. Then came the sound, a thin, high-pitched wail that pierced the shadows of the attic and made the candlelight tremble in its dish. Madeleine wept softly, but not from exhaustion. She reached out, cradled the tiny child against her chest, and murmured through trembling lips, "Claire, mon étoile, my star." Outside, the rain continued. The midwife did not ask about the father. She had delivered dozens of children in rooms like this one, rooms where men did not return, where names were never written. She wiped her hands, nodded once, and disappeared into the wet night, leaving mother and child to the hush of the storm and the creak of the beams overhead. Claire Delacourt was born with a head of dark, curling hair, and eyes that blinked open sooner than expected, wide and watchful. Even in those first hours, she did not cry unless she was cold or hungry. There was a stillness to her, not born of weakness, but of concentration. She studied the light as it played across the ceiling, followed the sounds of distant carriages with her tiny ears. Madeleine, though warned from labour, watched her daughter with a mixture of awe and sorrow. She had nothing to offer her child, no wealth, no name, no father to speak of, only a life stitched together from hours at the washtub and days spent bending over steaming pails along the riverbank. Their attic room was small but dry. Madeleine hung cloths to keep the wind from whistling through the eaves, and she padded the floor with old wool to soften the creak of the boards. She warmed milk over the hearth and mashed softened bread into paste when Claire was old enough to taste food. She sang to her, low, crooning melodies about far-off kingdoms and gowns of silk that shimmered under moonlight. Madeline's hands were calloused from years of labour, but gentle as feathers when they touched Claire's face. By the time Claire could sit upright, she had become fascinated with her surroundings. The glint of a copper kettle, the fold of the curtain that separated their bed from the wash basin, the soft, unravelling edge of a woolen shawl. All of it was a source of endless study. She would reach out for fabrics, pulling at stray threads, running her small fingers across textures as if memorizing their stories. By the age of 4, she was mimicking her mother's motions with the laundry, dipping scraps into water and slapping them against a barrel with dramatic flair. Madeline laughed quietly the first time she saw this, but her eyes grew serious afterward. She could not deny that Claire had cleverness in her bones, a quickness, an awareness, and so she began to teach her. At first, it was simple: how to fold cloth evenly, how to knot a thread, how to rinse soap from linen without wasting water. Claire absorbed it all. Her tiny hands moved precisely, her gaze flickering from her mother's fingers to her own, copying the movements until they were hers. Madeline saw then that Claire would not be like the other washer girls who grew up to carry basins until their backs broke. She would be something else, something more. When Claire turned 6, Madeline showed her how to sew a straight stitch. It was a rainy evening, much like the one when Claire was born. A scrap of muslin rested on the table between them. Madeline handed her a long needle, dulled at the point to protect her fingers, and a spool of grey thread. "This is how we make beauty from nothing," she said. Claire nodded solemnly and began. The first stitches were uneven, too loose, then too tight, but she did not pout. She did not grow frustrated. Instead, she furrowed her brow and tried again, and again, and again. By night's end, the muslin bore a crooked line of thread, and Claire's first smile in days. In the years that followed, sewing became her language. Claire stitched everything: her dolls' dresses, scraps of fabric into tiny pouches, the hems of her mother's worn skirts. She practiced on rags from the butcher downstairs, sewing loops and curves and rows until her fingers were sore and her eyes heavy. She became known in the neighborhood. The butcher's wife asked her to fix a tear in her apron. A cobbler's daughter came by with a shawl that needed repair. In return, they gave her fruit, crusts of bread, broken buttons she collected like treasure. Each gift she accepted with quiet gratitude, always offering more than she received. But Claire's world was not kind. The winters bit hard. The summers stank of fish and waste and sweat. The attic roof leaked, and Madeline's lungs grew weaker. She coughed at night, long rattling fits that left her breathless and pale. Claire made her tea, propped her pillows, and pressed warm cloths to her back. But the illness lingered. When Claire was 10, her mother collapsed at the riverbank while scrubbing the skirts of a marquise's wife. No one helped her. By the time Claire was summoned, she found her lying on a blanket, eyes dull, breath shallow. She died 3 days later, hand in Claire's, murmuring her name one last time. Claire did not cry. She folded her mother's shawl, packed her needles, and wrapped her fingers around the sampler she had stitched years before, the one Madeline had kept in her chest, like a letter. She left the attic with nothing but a bundle of fabric and the resolve that she would never return. She walked for hours, asking no one for help, until she reached the tailor's shop on Rue des Oiseaux. The windows were dark, the signs swinging in the breeze. Inside, the shop smelled of wool and lavender and dust. Claire stepped inside. Madame Agnès looked up, spectacles perched on the bridge of her nose. She was sorting bolts of fabric, her back curved like the bow of a boat. "I can sew," Claire said softly. The old woman stared at her for a long time, then said, "Let me see." Claire handed her the sampler. After a long silence, Madame Agnès said, "You'll sleep behind the stove. No talking, no complaining." Claire nodded. She had found the next stitch in her life. Claire's life at the tailor's shop began not with kindness, but with the firm discipline of repetition. Madame Agnès was not a woman prone to softness or indulgence. She did not ask Claire's story, nor did she offer sympathy. What she gave was space, a place to sleep behind the stove, a cracked bowl for soup, and access to fabric, thread, and a world of endless observation. The first morning began before sunrise. Claire was woken by the clang of the shop bell as the day's bread delivery arrived, accompanied by the quick clatter of hooves and the growl of voices on the street. She sat up quickly, heart pounding, and began folding her blanket before Madame Agnès even called for her. Her hands still trembled as she tied back her hair and stood quietly by the door, awaiting instruction. The workroom was dim at that hour, the only light coming from the fire that was coaxed to life by a kettle of water and a handful of dry kindling. Shadows curled in the corners, and the silence was broken only by the soft brushing of fabric being unrolled and measured. Madame Agnès handed Claire a pair of scissors and a stack of linen napkins. "These are to be hemmed. 2 threads in, whip-stitch, clean corners. If I see one fray, you'll redo the lot." Claire nodded. She did not speak. She sat on the small stool near the back wall, where the floor sloped slightly, and the scent of lavender sachets hung in the air like perfume that had lost its strength. She unspooled her thread, cut a clean length, and began. She worked until her hands ached. By midday, Madame Agnès examined the stack and said only, "Passable." Claire felt something inside her unclench. Not pride, not relief, just permission to continue, to stay. That night, as she ladled stew into her bowl from the shop's kitchen hearth, she noticed a spool of golden thread resting near the back of the shelf. She reached for it. The end of the thread shimmered in the firelight. Something about it felt alive, like a ribbon of sunlight, waiting to be woven into something greater. She didn't take it. She didn't yet know what she was worthy of. In the days that followed, Claire learned everything the shop could teach. She swept the floors and dusted the shelves, refolded bolts of fabric, learned to distinguish damask from brocade by touch alone. Madame Agnès was relentless. She spoke rarely and corrected often. She demanded silence while working, and made Claire redo the same hem 3 times in one afternoon, when the stitches drifted too near the edge. But there were moments, brief and fleeting, when Claire felt seen. Once, Madame Agnès handed her a sleeve to repair. The lace had frayed, the cuff discoloured. Claire reworked it carefully, adding a delicate vine motif to cover the damage. When she handed it back, the old woman narrowed her eyes, examined the new detail, and then, without a word, left it in place. Another time, Claire redrew a bodice pattern that had been smudged with ink. Her lines were clean, more precise than the original. Madame Agnès simply rolled it up and placed it in the commission folder. It was not praise, it was not affection, but it was trust. She began to speak, occasionally, never more than a sentence or two, when asked a direct question, when something was urgent, but she listened constantly. She listened to the clients, their whispered worries about waistlines and wedding dates. She listened to the apprentices grumbling about sore fingers and dull needles. She listened to Madame Agnès sighing late at night as she sorted coin purses and calculated bills. Claire learned that every person had a story, and most of them were told not in what they said, but in what they wore. She began to see that a faded hem meant a dress had been walked in too many times, that mismatched buttons meant repairs done in desperation, that a gown too tight at the bust meant someone was trying to appear younger, or wealthier, or more desirable. Fashion was not vanity. It was a coded language, a shield, a plea, and Claire became fluent in it. By the time she was 12, she had her own table in the back corner of the workroom, beneath the window that looked out onto the narrow alley where laundry was hung in long, swaying lines. She organized her threads by shade, sharpened her own scissors, and began drafting designs in a small sketchbook Madame Agnès allowed her to keep. Her drawings were simple at first, clean lines, a few flourishes, but gradually they grew more elaborate. She drew coats for gentlemen with long flowing collars, fitted with hidden pockets and lined with fine silk. She imagined gowns for noble women that moved like music, with pleats that unfolded like petals and sleeves shaped like candle flames. She even drew work dresses for washerwomen, strong, practical, but elegant in their restraint. She worked late into the night, sometimes forgetting to eat. Madame Agnès never commented on the drawings, but one day Claire returned from sweeping the storefront to find one of her sketches pinned to the cutting wall, copied onto parchment and annotated for tailoring. She stared at it for a long time. Then she returned to work. The shop gained reputation. Customers began asking for the quiet girl's designs, and Madame Agnès, ever shrewd, nodded and smiled, but never said Claire's name. Claire didn't care. She wasn't ready to be known. Not yet. Then came the day that changed everything. A carriage rolled to a stop outside the shop. Black lacquer, silver trim, a crest etched into the door. The horses were spotless, their manes braided with care. The driver dismounted and opened the carriage without a word. From within stepped a woman draped in violet silk, her face partly hidden by a veil. She moved like someone who had never been hurried in her life. Claire recognized the figure immediately. She had seen her once before, years ago, stepping into a coach on the Rue Saint-Honoré. Victoire d'Armentières, lady-in-waiting to Madame de Pompadour. The woman stepped into the shop, her gloved hands clasped at her waist. She surveyed the room as if she already owned it. Then her eyes fell on Claire. "You are the one who made the vine sleeve," she said. Claire stood up straight. "Yes, madame." "You work in silence?" "Yes." Victoire turned, inspecting a gown on the mannequin. "You will come to Versailles," she said, her voice cool and final. "You'll present your work. If it is accepted, you will stay. If not, you will not return here." Then she left. Madame Agnès did not speak. Claire did not ask. She packed her things that night, a bundle of thread, her sketchbook, a single thimble, and the golden spool she had once dared not touch. She placed it gently in the center of her bag. The next morning, she left before dawn. The city was still asleep, and Claire Delacourt walked into her future, the sound of her boots on the wet stone echoing like the first notes of a symphony yet to be written. The carriage that arrived for Claire was finer than any she had ever touched, let alone ridden in. Its windows were edged in velvet curtains, and the bench inside was cushioned with thick green brocade that smelled faintly of lavender and lemon polish. The driver, a stiff-backed man in a long coat with brass buttons, did not offer words or greetings. He simply gestured to the open door, waited for her to climb in, then snapped the reins and set the horses into motion with mechanical precision. Claire sat upright, her small bundle of possessions clutched tightly to her lap. She did not look back at the shop. She had already said her silent goodbye to the work table, to the thread drawer, to the cracked window pane that let in golden streaks of morning light. Madame Agnès had not come down to see her off. The old woman had merely placed a wrapped parcel on the cutting table the night before, with Claire's name written in a hand as sharp and economical as her speech. Inside had been a finely made pair of shears, steel, polished, honed to perfection. Claire had held them for a long time. She had not cried. Now, as the streets of Paris gave way to the rolling countryside, her mind turned inward, tracing the seams of memory and possibility, like the edge of a gown that had yet to be finished. She watched as the houses thinned out, replaced by vineyards and open fields, then forests with thick trunks and branches that bowed over the road like archways in a cathedral. The hum of the carriage wheels, the occasional stamp of a hoof, the creak of wood. These were the only sounds in her world for hours. Versailles was farther than she expected. As the day deepened, so did the sky's color, shifting from a cloudy grey to the pale rose of late afternoon. Claire's hands relaxed little by little as she stared out the window, watching how the light gilded the edges of distant clouds. The countryside was clean, almost quiet in its perfection, as if nothing truly violent had ever touched it. But Versailles was not quiet. She felt it before she saw it. There was a tension in the air as they drew closer, a subtle pressure, like the hush that precedes a great storm, or the pause just before a performer steps into the spotlight. The road curved slightly and rose toward a broad hill. And then, quite suddenly, the trees parted, and there it was. It didn't rise from the earth, it dominated it. The palace of Versailles stretched like a golden horizon across the land, its countless windows catching the low sunlight and reflecting it in every direction. From this distance, it seemed unreal, like a structure from a story, a castle imagined in a child's dream. But as they approached, the size of it became undeniable. The sheer scale of the place dwarfed the trees, the gardens, even the sky itself. Claire could see the sculptures along the rooftops, each one poised like a sentinel. Fountains sparkled in the distance. Everything was lined, gilded, manicured, and measured. She sat up straighter. When the carriage reached the gates, the guards, 2 men in navy coats and powdered wigs, barely glanced before waving it through. They recognized the crest. The wheels clicked over the cobbled approach, echoing against the stone walls, as if the palace itself were taking notice of its newest arrival. They did not enter through the front. The carriage veered to the left, toward the servants' entrance, a discreet archway set behind a cluster of stables and storage buildings. Here, the glamour of Versailles softened slightly. The air smelled of hay and bread, and voices carried more freely. Men hauled crates. Women in aprons darted from door to door, with baskets on their hips and urgency in their steps. No one looked idle. Everyone moved with purpose. Claire stepped out of the carriage and stood for a moment, blinking at the sudden contrast between the grandeur she had seen and the sweat that powered it. A steward approached, reading from a sheet of paper. "Claire Delacourt?" "Yes." "You'll be in the East Wing, Workshop 3. Follow the hall to the end, down the stairs. Meals are taken in the servants' kitchen. You're expected in the atelier tomorrow at dawn." He handed her a small wooden tag, marked with her name, and turned away before she could ask anything more. Claire walked slowly toward the East Wing, her boots making dull sounds on the stone as she passed rows of identical doors and polished brass sconces that held flickering oil lamps. The ceilings were high, even in this part of the palace, but the corridors were narrow, twisting, and filled with strange echoes, steps that didn't always belong to visible feet, voices that drifted through walls too thick to explain it. When she reached her room, she found it small and windowless, with a narrow cot, a wash basin, and a peg for her belongings. There was a small stool by the wall and a folded blanket left on the mattress. Nothing more, but it was clean, and it was hers. She unpacked slowly, placing her shears in a folded cloth on the stool. Her sketchbook went under the mattress. She unwrapped the golden spool and placed it on the edge of the wash basin, where it caught the light from the hall and glowed faintly, like a quiet promise. She did not sleep much that night. The sounds of the palace were too new, too many murmurs in the walls, too many footsteps just beyond her door. She lay awake, tracing imagined stitches into the air above her, dreaming not of gowns or nobility, but of needles, thread, and silence. Before the first bell rang, she was already dressed. She found her way to Workshop 3 by memory and instinct, passing yawning servants and fire-stokers on her way. The door was tall, arched, and unmarked. When she stepped inside, the room was already bright with early light, spilling through high windows onto bolts of cloth laid out in perfect order. There were 3 other seamstresses already at work, women older than her, focused on their tasks. The walls were lined with mannequins, draped in half-completed creations. Claire could smell beeswax, lavender, and starch. The room buzzed with quiet energy, and at the far end stood a woman in a deep green gown, her silver hair pulled back in a bun, as precise as the pleats she was inspecting. "Claire Delacourt," she said without looking up. "Yes, madame." "I am Madame Giraud. I lead this atelier. Speak only when necessary. Mistakes will be corrected. Skill will be recognized. You begin now." She handed Claire a bolt of muslin and gestured to an empty work table. "Drape a bodice. Your proportions are standard. I want a natural waistline, no boning, no flare. Show me that you understand structure." Claire nodded and took her place at the table. Her hands moved before her thoughts caught up. She unrolled the muslin, ran her fingers along its edge, and let the fabric speak to her. It was soft, but firm, with a good weight. She centered it on the mannequin, pinned at the shoulder, adjusted the folds at the waist. She measured without tools. She knew her own body well enough to estimate the proportions. She moved steadily, without flair, but with confidence. The room faded around her. She did not hear the footsteps, the doors, the soft sighs of other workers, only the fabric, the pins, the scissors, the thread, each motion an echo of her earliest lessons, of her mother's voice, of the tiny attic room where this all began. When she stepped back, her hands still raised, as if she could press the air into place, she saw Madame Giraud standing behind her. The older woman looked at the drape. Her eyes scanned the seams, the lay of the cloth. Then, with a voice as cool and measured as a freshly pressed pleat, she said, "You will stay." The days that followed moved with the kind of rhythm only found in places ruled by hierarchy, repetition, and quiet obsession. Claire quickly learned that Versailles was a world built not only on grandeur and spectacle, but on invisible labor and unbearable precision. Behind every golden arch, every polished mirror, every cloud of powdered wig and perfumed skin, was an army of craftsmen, cooks, candle makers, lace weavers, perfumers, cleaners, and tailors who spun illusion into reality from before dawn until long after the sun had set. In Workshop 3, Claire found her place not as an apprentice, but as a silence. She said little, asked nothing, but observed everything. The other seamstresses, two of whom had been in the court service for nearly a decade, initially ignored her. One, named Brigitte, was plump and fond of humming while she worked. The other, Solange, had sharp cheekbones, sharper eyes, and a tongue she rarely wasted on kindness. At first, they treated Claire like a shadow, another body in the room, another pair of hands to finish hems and tack ribbons. But then came the day of the lace disaster. Brigitte had been tasked with repairing the hem of a Madame d'Alençon's evening gown, an extravagantly delicate confection of ivory tulle and hand-knotted Alençon lace that had taken weeks to construct. The gown had caught on a servant's candlestick during its last outing and required immediate restoration for a ball only 3 nights away. But Brigitte had overestimated her steadiness and undercut the scallop pattern. The damage was visible, subtle, yes, but enough that the repetition of the lace motif was broken. In the world outside Versailles, it would have passed unnoticed. Inside Versailles, it was unforgivable. Solange hissed as soon as she saw it. "She'll have your head." Brigitte turned pale and collapsed into her chair, moaning quietly, as if the weight of failure had stolen the strength from her bones. Claire stepped forward, without a word. She took the gown in her arms, studied the mistake, then disappeared into the supply room. Solange muttered something bitter, but Claire didn't hear it. She had already slipped into the place she knew best. Deep focus. She took matching lace from the shelf and traced the original design with the tip of a pencil, mimicking the weave with the eye of someone who remembered the feel of fabric in her dreams. Then she sat, stitched, breathed, and kept stitching until the pattern was no longer a wound, but a whisper. When she brought the gown back out, no one spoke for a long moment. Madame Giraud, called in to inspect, tilted her head slightly and ran her fingers over the repaired hem. "Where did you learn to copy lace this fine?" Claire said simply, "I saw it once in a window when I was 8. From that moment forward, the other seamstresses watched her differently, not as a threat, but with something closer to wary respect. And from that moment forward, Madame Giraud assigned her only the most intricate tasks. Claire thrived under the weight of complexity. She understood instinctively that fashion at Versailles was not about comfort or functionality. It was about meaning, about posture, about controlling the message of one's own body in a world where words could not always be trusted. A ribbon could declare mourning. A ruffled cuff could signal flirtation. The position of a bow on the shoulder instead of the wrist could determine whether a glance at dinner would be interpreted as innocence or invitation. Versailles spoke its own dialect of beauty, and Claire became fluent faster than any apprentice in memory. She began to stay late in the workroom, long after the others had gone to eat or sleep. She traced patterns on parchment. She experimented with layered pleating techniques no one else had time to try. She kept her sketchbook open at all times, adding notes and ideas with a charcoal nub, until her fingers were always faintly grey. The room slowly became hers, even if no one said so aloud. The palace itself, beyond the atelier, was another world entirely. On her breaks, Claire began to wander, quietly, respectfully, never intruding. She learned the routes of the servants' passages, where the halls turned, where voices echoed. She watched the noblewomen float through the marble galleries, like ghosts in powdered wigs and jewelled shoes, each one a portrait brought to life, their corsets stiff, their fans fluttering, their gazes sharp as daggers behind layers of powder. She learned which duchesses had feuds, which ones preferred velvet over taffeta, who cried in the dressing room, and who insisted on an extra corset layer to guard the heart. It was on one of these early wanderings, during a midday delivery of silks to the northern salon, that she first heard the music, a harpsichord, soft, melodic, played with thoughtfulness rather than performance. The sound emerged from a room just beyond her path, unmarked, the door slightly ajar. She paused for a moment, hands still on the tray of silk rolls, listening. The music was gentle and yet precise, with a sadness beneath its elegance. It reminded her of snowfall, of late nights sewing beside a candle, of Adrian's voice once drifting through memory like a promise. A voice called from within, low and clear. "You may come in." She stepped back, startled. There, seated at the harpsichord, was a man, young, no older than 30, with unruly dark hair and a face that carried the weariness of someone who had seen more than he should have. His fingers lingered on the keys, as if still deciding whether to play another note or close the instrument altogether. "I wasn't," she began. "You weren't supposed to hear," he said, smiling faintly. "Neither was I supposed to be playing. And yet, here we are." She lowered her eyes. "I was delivering silk." He nodded at the tray in her arms. "You carry fabric like it's fragile as glass. Do you sew?" She nodded once. "Of course you do," he said. "You have the hands of someone who knows how to fix things that break." He stood slowly, crossed the room with quiet steps, and reached for the topmost roll of silk. He didn't touch it, just looked. "Do you know what I do?" he asked. She shook her head. "I'm a tuner," he said, "of instruments, and if I'm careful, of people." His smile was faint, wry, but genuine. "My name is Luke," he said. "And you are?" "Claire." He tilted his head slightly. "Well then, Claire, perhaps we are both here, because someone forgot to close a door." She turned to leave, unsure what to say. As she stepped back into the hallway, He called gently, "Come again sometime. I'd like to hear what your silence sounds like." She didn't reply, but that night, in the quiet of her room, she took out her sketchbook and drew a harpsichord. In the center of its lid, she stitched a name: Luke. Claire did not return to the music room the next day, nor the one after that. She continued with her work, folding herself back into the fabric of the atelier, where the sound of scissors against table wood and the brush of chalk on muslin was her music, her rhythm, her life. But Luke's voice and the softness in his playing stayed with her, as though it had been stitched into her thoughts without her consent. At night, when the corridors hushed and the wind slipped through the chimneys, she would sometimes hear phantom notes echo in the space between sleep and silence. A week passed before she saw him again. It was late afternoon, and she had been sent to deliver a tray of fabric swatches to a lady-in-waiting with a reputation for being impossible to please. Claire moved through the corridors swiftly, the folded silks tucked beneath her arm, her slippers whispering over the polished stone floor. She turned a corner near the Queen's private drawing room and nearly collided with him. Luke. He caught her by the elbow, gently, to steady her. His hand was warm and sure. "Well," he said, smiling, "it appears I've found the seamstress with the silent step." Claire felt her heart stumble in her chest. "You're everywhere," he added, "like a well-placed stitch, just visible enough to hold everything together." She allowed the corner of her mouth to lift, almost a smile. Luke's eyes softened. "Will you come hear me play again?" She hesitated. He took the silence as permission. That evening, after the workshop lamps had been extinguished and the rest of the seamstresses had shuffled down to their meals or their pallets, Claire stepped quietly out of the east wing, passing beneath the arched gallery that led to the unused music room. She paused at the door. It was ajar again. Inside, the harpsichord awaited like an invitation. Luke was there, as she knew he would be. The air smelled faintly of cedar and wax, and the last rays of sun painted golden lines across the floorboards. He was already playing when she entered. Not a courtly tune, but something quieter, slower, the kind of music that felt like falling leaves or drifting snow. He didn't look up. She sat near the wall, in the low wooden chair beside a narrow window, and folded her hands in her lap. When he finished, he turned. "You're not like them," he said. "Not like the others who wear the gold and speak in ribbons." Claire looked at him evenly. "Neither are you." He chuckled. "I suppose I'm not, though I pretend well enough. I play music that pleases them. I keep my head down. I smile. I compliment their choices in wine and blush fabric. And yet," he turned back to the keys, "and yet I find myself composing in minor keys, writing poems in the margins of tuning sheets, and wondering if Versailles might one day crumble from the weight of its own lies." Claire didn't speak, but he looked at her as though she already understood. "Do you know what I see when I look at you, Claire Delacourt?" he asked. She tilted her head, just slightly. "I see a woman who was meant to build beauty in a place that prefers illusion, someone who stitches truth into seams and leaves the rest of us guessing." She felt heat rise beneath her collarbone, but she said nothing. She didn't need to. Luke spoke like someone who had long grown used to silence from others, someone who could read between glances, between movements. That night, She did not return to her room until long after curfew. She slipped back through the servants' hallway unseen, her steps as soft as breath, her thoughts loud as thunder. From then on, they met once a week, always in the same room, always when the halls were empty and the world was distracted with masquerades, or midnight suppers, or endless games of courtly manipulation. Luke would play, Claire would listen, and sometimes they would speak about things no one else seemed to say aloud, about the peasants in the fields beyond the golden gates, about the price of lace compared to a month's bread, about how beauty could be a kind of rebellion, how truth could be sewn into gowns that smiled and lied and shimmered with secrets. She told him of her childhood, sparingly. He asked little, but when he did, his questions were never casual. They were careful, as though he understood the weight behind the words she hadn't said. And she, in turn, learned that he had once studied philosophy in Lyon, had spoken too loudly in the wrong tavern, and had been quietly disappeared from polite circles. Versailles, for him, was both prison and disguise. They fell in love like two people who had known love would never be safe. Not here, not surrounded by marble and politics and eyes that saw too much. Their affection was a quiet current beneath the surface. It was not kisses in open gardens or stolen glances in court. It was the brushing of hands as she passed him thread, the extra note he left in his music for her to notice. The way he tuned instruments with such care that each tone reminded her of the difference between surviving and living. She stitched symbols into her work, tiny ones, hidden in lace patterns, the outline of a swallow in a corner seam, a silver ribbon tied in a way that mirrored a poem he had once recited. Each gown she made became a message only he could read, a language beneath the surface. No one knew, or so she thought. One evening, as the fire burned low in the music room, Luke placed his hand over hers. "There are whispers," he said. Claire looked at him. "About me, about pamphlets." He paused. "About you." She went very still. "They're watching more closely now," he said. "Everything feels tighter, heavier." Claire nodded slowly. Luke reached into his coat and handed her a small folded sheet. "Keep it hidden. Read it when you're alone." It was a poem, one he had written for her. She pressed it to her chest and left without another word. 2 nights later, he vanished. No one said it directly, but she heard it in the silence that replaced the music, in the way the guards lingered longer outside the salon, in the way Madame Giraud avoided her eyes, in the absence that echoed louder than footsteps. Luke was gone, taken, questioned, possibly worse. Claire did not cry. She did not scream. She simply lit a candle and began to sew. She sewed as if the thread were breath itself, as if the fabric in her hands was the only thing holding the weight of her world together. Her fingers worked steadily, precisely, without tremor, even though her chest felt hollow and her eyes burned with unshed grief. She stitched for hours, through meals, through sleep, through the turning of the moon beyond the high atelier windows. She did not ask where Luke had gone. There were no answers in Versailles for questions like that, only silences that grew louder the more you probed them. Those who disappeared were rarely spoken of again, and when they were, it was in whispers, behind gloved hands and closed fans. Claire understood the danger. She had lived with it, from the moment Luke first pressed a folded pamphlet into her fingers, from the moment he had first said her name, as though it was something he wanted to protect. But what she had not expected was how swiftly the absence would change her. The gowns she created in the days after Luke's disappearance were unlike anything she, or the atelier, had produced before. They were quieter, subtler. The colours she chose seemed drawn from dusk and fog. Soft greys, smoky lavenders, deep, muted blues. But within their simplicity lay something else. Depth, truth, a quiet resistance, stitched into every hem, every fold, every elegant pleat. She began to incorporate symbolism that only she understood. A daisy motif, with each petal pointing to the left, his signature in the corners of his music. A lining embroidered with the profile of a swallow, wings tucked, mid-flight. She stitched tiny letters into hidden seams. An L here, a C there. No one noticed. Or perhaps they did, and were too afraid to say. The court, in its eternal hunger for novelty, loved it. Her new designs were declared bold, poised, sophisticated. The Dauphine herself asked for a morning gown, with all the quiet of snowfall. Claire delivered a silk masterpiece with a train that rippled like wind over a still lake. No one knew that the embroidery across the back told a story in a pattern only Luke would have recognized, if he ever returned to see it. Time did not slow. Versailles never stopped. Balls continued. Laughter echoed in golden corridors. Rumours bloomed and died like roses in a heated greenhouse. And Claire rose. She became the favoured couturière, not only for the Queen's circle, but for women of influence far beyond. Duchesses, marquises, foreign dignitaries' wives. Her name was passed from lips to lips, always with reverence, often with a touch of fear. For though she was always silent, always composed, there was something in her eyes that unsettled. People said she saw too much. She was given her own chamber near the atelier, small, but with a tall window and a narrow bed, a desk, a mirror she rarely used. On its sill she placed a single item, a strip of folded parchment, the one Luke had given her. She never unfolded it again. She didn't need to. Every line lived in her already. She still had his last piece of music. Sometimes, when the halls were empty and the night was still, she would hum it, barely audible, just enough to remind the stones that something had once existed there that could not be gilded or silenced. Her relationship with Madame Giraud shifted. They spoke rarely, but when they did, it was in measured, almost respectful tones. The older woman never asked about Claire's late-night hours, or the changes in her designs. Perhaps she knew. Perhaps she had lost someone once too. There was something different in her posture now. Less command, more acknowledgement. One morning, Madame Giraud brought Claire a cup of hot tea without speaking, placed it on her work table, and walked away. Claire nodded, but did not drink it. When the spring came, Versailles changed again. The gardens bloomed in full, riots of colour spilling into every corner of the marble grounds. The nobles emerged from their winter hiding places with renewed vanity. Parties became more extravagant, costumes more elaborate, music more frantic. But beneath it all, the ground trembled. Word came from Paris, bread shortages, protests, soldiers in the streets, a crowd outside the cathedral. In the palace, This news was treated like a breeze rattling a curtain, an inconvenience, not a storm. The nobles rolled their eyes, made jokes about peasants and pitchforks. Some ordered extra guards. Most just laughed. But Claire noticed things, how the kitchens began to receive smaller deliveries, how servants whispered more softly when they thought no one heard, how even the Queen's face, once an unmoving mask of powdered serenity, began to show lines of tension. One afternoon, while fitting a dress for a noblewoman known for her cruelty to staff, Claire was ordered to remake the corset twice. Too tight, too loose, too tight again, until her fingers were raw and her patience worn thin. When she finished, she excused herself and left the room, hands shaking. She did not go to her quarters. She went to the chapel. It was empty. She sat in the last row, beneath the high arch ceiling, and pressed her hands together, not in prayer, but in memory. She thought of Luc, of his laugh, his fingers, the way he looked at her when she was too afraid to speak. Then she stood, went back to the atelier, and began to design something new. It was not a gown. It was not for any client. It was something else. She chose cloth from her own hidden stock, black velvet that shimmered with faint silver when turned to the light, thread she had dyed herself, long ago, in deep crimson. She worked by moonlight, layering fabric over form, shaping a coat that was not beautiful in the courtly sense, but powerful, protective, like armor. She stitched Luc's name into the collar lining. She embroidered a line of music along the hem, his last composition, and she finished it with a clasp in the shape of a swallow, carved from mother of pearl and bone. She folded it carefully, wrapped it in muslin, and placed it in a cedar box beneath her bed. She never told anyone what it was, but she knew that one day someone would wear it, and when they did, the truth would rise. Life in Versailles carried on, as it always did, gilded and gleaming and full of rehearsed delight. The fountains still danced, the musicians still played, the ladies still swept into salons with swaying panniers and powdered curls. But beneath the polish, Claire saw the fraying edge, like the hem of an evening gown worn too many times, still beautiful from a distance, but unraveling with every step. She began to withdraw, slightly, not from her work, that she performed with even greater focus, but from the social machinery of the court. She declined invitations to attend dinners with the noblewomen she dressed. She avoided lingering in halls where gossip thickened the air like perfume. She became more elusive, a ghost with a needle. Some said she worked magic. Others said she was cursed. Claire neither confirmed nor denied anything. And then, in the middle of a warm and amber-drenched autumn, Adrian entered her life. It was not dramatic. It was not immediate. It was a slow unfolding. She met him on a morning when the sun was low in the sky, and the palace corridors had not yet shaken off their shadows. She was carrying a bundle of dress forms down to the laundry for steaming, when her foot caught on a loose floor tile. She stumbled, did not fall, but the bundle slipped from her arms and scattered in all directions. He appeared beside her as if conjured, kneeling with an easy grace, gathering up the fallen forms. "Careful," he said, not sharply, not kindly, but with a kind of gentle humor, as if it was the sort of thing he expected to happen every day. "The floor always takes its toll." Claire looked up. He was taller than her by half a head, with tousled brown hair that he hadn't bothered to powder, and hands darkened from work, scraped knuckles, wax in the creases, calluses from labour. His sleeves were rolled up. He smelled faintly of beeswax and citrus. His eyes were warm. "Thank you," she said softly, retrieving the last form. "Adrian," he offered, standing. "Candlemaker, third chamber, south wing. Claire, seamstress, atelier 3, dot." He nodded once. "Your hands," he said suddenly. She looked down. "What about them?" "They're like mine, burned, stiff, but precise." His smile returned, quiet and lopsided. "People don't understand what our work costs." Then he was gone, rolling a cart of candle moulds down the corridor before she could reply. The next time she saw him, it was by chance, or perhaps not. He arrived at the atelier to deliver a new batch of beeswax for the irons. He carried a crate over one shoulder, like it weighed nothing. When he set it down, he glanced around, saw her by the window. "Your tea," he said, "smells like it needs honey." She blinked. "I didn't make tea." "But when you do," he replied, "you'll want this." And he placed a small jar of honey on the corner of her table. The lid was sealed with wax, stamped in the shape of a flame. She watched him walk away and did not speak for the rest of the day. It became a rhythm after that. He would appear, always quietly, always without warning, with something small, a candle that burned without smoke, a ribbon of wax shaped like a rose, a cone of sugar wrapped in linen. He never lingered long, never pushed. But every visit felt like a thread being tugged gently through the fabric of her days. They spoke more often, then more deeply, not of court matters, never of fashion or politics, or what had become of Luke. They spoke of materials, of heat and pressure, of how wax held its form only when cooled, but was most pliable just before it hardened, of how fabric, if mistreated, remembered every fold. He told her that his mother had been a weaver, that he'd learned to twist wicks by watching her braid hair, that he liked the quiet best, the moment just before a candle's flame caught, when everything was breath and potential. She told him only one story, about how, when she was small, her mother had taught her to mend socks with such tiny stitches the seams felt like part of the wool itself. Adrian didn't ask more. He simply listened. And Claire, who had once loved with fear and urgency, and the constant knowledge that it could be taken away in an instant, found herself falling into something different, something steadier, something like trust. He began walking her home, slowly, carrying her scissors if her arms were full, or simply placing one hand gently against her back when they crossed the darker corridors. She led him. On a winter night, when the snow whispered down over the courtyards and the marble statues shivered beneath their frost, Claire invited him into her chamber. She didn't speak. She simply unpinned her apron, turned down the single candle's wick, and let him see her, not as the court's silent artist, but as a woman who had bled into every gown she'd ever made, and loved a man who had vanished into shadow. Adrian kissed her with warmth, not fire, and when he stayed, he didn't ask where the locked box beneath her bed came from. In the months that followed, their lives knit themselves together in quiet, domestic ways. He lined her drawers with linen that smelled of orange blossom. She made him fingerless gloves for the candle rooms. he brought her wax in new colours. She embroidered him a pillowcase with stars. They did not speak of forever. They didn't need to. But they had found, in each other, something like stillness, like a hearth no storm could touch. And for a time, that was enough. In the cold hush of those months, with snow building up against the narrow window-sills, and the palace corridors echoing with soft boots and muffled voices, Claire and Adrian lived in a small world within a very large one. It was not the world of the nobles, with their golden brocades and jewelled gloves, nor the scuttling world of the scullery and stables. It was a quiet sphere, carved between the folds of obligation, stitched, like one of Claire's hidden messages, between layers of silk and silence. Their room was modest, tucked above the east wing workshops, where the smell of heated irons and lavender oil drifted faintly up through the floorboards. There was a window, narrow and high, that let in the palest light by day and the silver trace of stars by night. A single chair sat beside the hearth. Adrian had carved it himself from discarded wood, smoothing its back until it fit the curve of Claire's spine perfectly. He never said that's why he shaped it so. But she knew. They shared their hours like notes in a song. Claire would rise early, dress in thick wool and padded slippers, and descend into the atelier before the light fully returned to the sky. Adrienne would walk her part way, carrying her work apron, brushing a kiss against her temple before peeling off toward the candle rooms. There he worked in heat and wax and silence, sculpting flame that would burn in the mirrored halls of Versailles, even as the world beyond the palace grew darker. At night they returned to each other. They ate simple food, black bread, soft cheese, dried figs. Sometimes Adrian would bring oranges smuggled from the court kitchens, and Claire would peel them slowly, placing each segment on his tongue with ink-stained fingers. They spoke in low voices about small things, how the thread had snapped that morning while hemming lace, or how the wax had cracked when the fire grew too hot. Their troubles were humble. Their peace was quiet. And for Claire, peace was a fragile, unfamiliar thing. She held it gently, like one holds an egg in the palm. But the world was changing. It began with whispers. One morning, the scullery boy didn't appear with the laundry basket. A week later, one of the coachmen was missing. A guard Claire had passed every day near the Queen's Hall was suddenly replaced by a boy whose hands trembled when he adjusted his musket. The servants stopped lingering to gossip. The noblewomen's smiles grew sharper, thinner. There were mutterings at fittings about Paris unrest and grain shortages, and Claire watched as even the finest jewels could no longer disguise the fear growing behind powdered eyes. Adrian heard it too. At night, he would sit beside her in the low firelight, his hands wrapped around a mug of mulled wine, his brow furrowed not with worry, but with listening, as if something in the walls had begun to hum, and he was the only one who could hear the first chord of collapse. "Do you feel it?" he asked one evening. Claire looked up from her sewing. "Yes," she said. She didn't have to ask what he meant. They spoke no more of it, but they began to prepare in subtle ways. Adrian sealed candles with sturdier wax. Claire began to make a duplicate set of her tools, smaller, easier to carry. They saved their coins, hid extra food in a narrow chest beneath the floorboards, and traced escape routes on scraps of parchment, folded and stored behind the hearthstone. It was not fear, it was readiness, The court, in contrast, leaned deeper into its dream. In the face of unrest, it doubled down on opulence. The balls grew more extravagant, the feasts more absurd. Gowns swelled to greater widths, adorned with imported lace and plumes of birds from islands no one in Versailles could even name. The king grew quieter, heavier, and more tired. The queen laughed more loudly, but her hands clutched her wine-glass too tightly. And Claire? She rose with the tide. Her skill, now legend, was demanded more than ever. The nobility, sensing change in the air, grasped for the only power they understood: appearance. They asked her to make them unforgettably beautiful. Claire complied. She made gowns that sang, dresses that seemed to hover above the marble floors, embroidery so fine it looked painted, like a hallucination. But in each one, she stitched something secret, a pattern that meant memory, a fold that mirrored a symbol from Luke's old pages, a hem that whispered resistance. No one noticed, or if they did, they said nothing. Perhaps the women sensed it, somewhere beneath the silk. Perhaps they wanted to feel like they, too, were part of something more than ornament. Claire kept a ledger, not of names and coin, but of symbols and signs. A crescent moon here, a pair of wings there, a line of notes embroidered in silver thread. Her rebellion was not loud. It was laced into luxury. One day, as spring stirred the frost from the palace grounds and daffodils bent gently in the breeze, Claire received a commission unlike any before, a gown for the queen herself. Not for ceremony, not for spectacle, for mourning. The queen's cousin had died unexpectedly, a sudden fever. The royal court required the appropriate display of grief, and quickly. Claire was summoned to the queen's private quarters, where pale attendants waited behind curtains, and every clock ticked too loudly. She bowed low. The queen, usually poised and radiant, was draped in a blue robe, and sat stiffly by the fire. "You are Claire Delacourt," she said. Claire nodded. "I've heard you sow truth into beauty." Claire said nothing. "Can you sow sorrow?" the queen asked. Claire met her eyes. "Yes." She returned to the atelier and worked through the night. The gown she made was black satin, but not flat. It rippled with depth. She layered it with dark lace, threaded in midnight blue, so faint only candlelight revealed it. The sleeves were narrow, graceful. The bodice cut to mirror a descending wave. The collar was high, but soft, folding like a mother's hand against a child's cheek. In the hem, she stitched the outline of a single teardrop. When it was worn, the queen stood taller, not with pride, but with acknowledgement. She said nothing as Claire presented it, only nodded. But that night, at the private viewing of the body, every eye turned to the queen, not for her jewels, not for her face, but for the story her dress told. Claire walked home late that night, beneath a sky brimming with stars, Adrian waiting by the hearth. "You look tired," he whispered. "I am," she said. He handed her a candle, lit just once, then blown out. "For when you need to remember," he said. She held it to her chest and said, "I already do." The months that followed moved like a slow breath before a scream. From Paris came the clamour of something no longer containable. There were no more whispers now. There were shouts, bells, marches, the sound of crowds where once there had only been silence. Letters arrived at the palace, sealed with broken wax and stained in urgency. Servants disappeared in the night, not quietly this time, but with purpose. Some left notes behind, some simply vanished, their absence speaking louder than any farewell. The king's guards grew tighter around the royal chambers. Muskets lined the hallways behind discreet curtains. Certain doors were suddenly locked. Some nobles sent their children away. Others sent jewels sewn into the hems of their cloaks, already preparing for the day when gold would weigh more than title. Claire watched it all. She stitched. She studied. She remembered. Her atelier, once bustling with fittings and noblewomen demanding pearl-threaded trains, grew quieter. The orders slowed. The silks came less frequently. The colours requested shifted. Once the palette of sky and spring, now a palette of dusk, of charcoal, of blood. Still, she sewed. And Adrian began melting wax with a new purpose. He made candles with secret hollows inside, filled with folded parchment, or silver, or messages written in soot and lemon. He stopped delivering to the grand halls. He started handing them off to kitchen boys, gardeners, maids, with knowing eyes. He burned his fingers more often now. Claire wrapped them in linen, kissed his palms, said nothing. They never used the word revolution aloud, but it was there, in every cautious glance, every extra step taken before turning corners, every pause at the sound of boots, echoing too closely. Then came the day everything changed. It began with shouting at the gates. Not distant shouting, but near, furious, thick with the sound of thousands of feet on stone. Claire stood at the edge of a high corridor and looked down into the courtyard, where a sea of people had gathered. Peasants, women, men with tools in their hands and fury in their throats. They carried makeshift banners. They chanted. They demanded bread and justice and reckoning. They demanded to be seen. The queen was rushed to her chambers. Guards sealed the salon doors. Servants fled in every direction. Panic spread like fire in silk. Claire didn't run. She returned to her quarters, packed only what she needed: her shears, her sketchbook, the coat she had made with Luke's music in the hem, and the candle Adrian had once given her, still unlit. When she turned to leave, Adrian was already there. He had a satchel over one shoulder and a bandage on his wrist. "They're in the kitchens already," he said. "I know. We need to go now." She hesitated. "I can't leave through the front," she said. "I'll be recognized. Too many know my name." He nodded. "Then we go under." The servants' tunnels, long, narrow, dark, were carved beneath the palace like veins. Few knew the full map. Adrian had memorized it over years. They moved quickly, silently, through candle-lit corridors that smelled of dust and time. Once they heard footsteps behind them. Claire held her breath, pressed herself to the stone. Adrian stepped in front of her, one hand on the wax seal hidden in his satchel. The footsteps passed. They emerged hours later at the edge of the forest beyond the palace grounds, their boots coated in soot, their lungs full of cold, clean air. Versailles burned behind them, not with fire, but with the sound of a dream unraveling. They did not look back. They walked until the palace became memory, until the perfume of marble halls and powdered wigs was replaced by the scent of pine and damp earth, until the world became wide again, until they found a town where no one knew them. They rented a room above a bakery, paid with the coins hidden in Adrian's candles and the skill in Claire's hands. She began to sew again, simple dresses for simple people. And yet, in every hem, she left a trace of who she had been. Word spread quietly that the seamstress from Versailles was not dead, that she had survived, that she carried stories in her thread and power in her silence. Years passed. They married quietly, beneath a willow tree on a fog-lit morning, with only the baker's son and a wandering priest to witness it. Adrian carved her a new chair for their new room. Claire stitched him a new coat, with a lining of sky blue and a collar that turned up against the wind. They never spoke of the palace, unless the wind smelled of lavender and hot iron, and even then, only in fragments. Claire grew older. Her hands remained steady, her eyes sharp, but her steps slowed. Adrian grew silver at the temples. Their love never faded. It deepened, settled, like tea steeped in warm water. One day, long after the smoke had cleared from Paris and the world had renamed itself, Claire sat by the window, a quilt in her lap, and said to Adrian, "I dreamed of music last night." He turned from his candle moulds and smiled. "His music?" She nodded. "I remember every note." That evening, she lit the candle he had once given her, Luke's candle, unburned for years. It flared briefly, brightly, then settled into a soft glow. They watched it burn, and in its light they saw the shape of their story, not one of court and crowns, but of fire and fabric, of silence and resistance, of love sown in shadow and worn through time. And when Claire's breath left her, years later, it did so gently, in her sleep, with Adrian's hand in hers, and the candlelight dancing across the walls. She was buried beneath the willow, wrapped in the coat she had made herself, the one with the music, the wings, the truth. And long after she was gone, people still spoke of her, not just the seamstress of Versailles, but the woman who stitched beauty from grief and left behind not gowns, but memory.